was October 31st, 2024, Halloween day, and what was supposed to be a 40-minute flight on checking out whether my Cherokee 6 was having any kind of fuel flow issues turned into one of the most terrifying days of my life, in where all of the pilot training and all of the pilot knowledge had to be put to the test. Instead of leaning the mixture, I was actually enriching it more. I'm just gonna go back into Prescott. Super loud bangs that came from the front of the aircraft. Boom, boom. Altitude is my friend. I had this just immense amount of thick, dark smoke filling the cabin.
Cherokee 154 Delta Charlie, copy, mayday, 4 miles east of the airport, 6,800 smoke in the cockpit. Are you able to come into the airport and land on runway 30?
So I'm in a box up in the air where I'm choking on smoke, and now I have fire. I remember hearing my flight instructor's voice, "Can you survive this?" Yeah, my name's Jon Rocha. I have a little over 215 hours rated on just single engine, looking to probably work on my instrument rating and start that training here in a few months. Like most people, I've put quite a few hours and trained on the Cessna 172s. After getting my private pilot's license, flew more of the Piper Cherokee 180s. Really liked the low wing setup and decided to buy a Cherokee 6 in June of 2024. A couple of days before, on climb out of Prescott, instead of leaning the mixture, I was actually enriching it more. And it wasn't anything excessive and it wasn't anything too alarming, but it was something that bothered me because that's really the opposite of what should be happening for the altitude that I was gaining. Fast forward now to 2 days later, it's Halloween. So I said, well, I have 2 to 3 hours. I'm gonna take this time to go and figure out that issue on the climb that the Cherokee gave me about 2 days ago. Nothing was evident in my pre-flight. Everything was normal, everything checked out. The airport, surprisingly enough, was slam busy. So I decided to not stay in the traffic or stay local, but that I felt comfortable enough to just maybe fly to Sedona, which is a 15-minute flight, and back again. And my goal for the flight was confirm that if I had the mixture give me issues again and I'm enriching rather than leaning, I was just gonna ground the airplane, call my mechanic, and have them take a look at it. So I take off from Prescott, and it did give me the same problem again. So on climb out, I noticed I was enriching it instead of leaning it. I get to cruise, it's normal. So I decide, okay, I'm gonna go over to Sedona and I'm just hawking my instruments, right? On that Cherokee 6, I had exhaust gas temperature gauges. I didn't have the CHTs, but I did have all probes into the EGTs. I'm just checking fuel flows, checking my EGT temperatures, and really just honing in on what that engine's trying to tell me or if there was something wrong. So I fly over to Sedona, everything's fine, flying over the mountains. I tell myself I'm gonna go towards another town to the southeast. So I go over to Camp Verde, which at that point I'm about 20 to 24 nautical miles away from Prescott. As soon as I'm crossing over the mountains, I'm starting to see that my EGTs, especially my hottest EGT, which is my number 5 cylinder, it's nothing alarming, but it is creeping up to the point where I know it's abnormal. And I make the decision at that point that I'm just gonna go back into Prescott, which is at this point due west of my location.
So Jon, did you notice anything during your pre-flight at all? Now you knew that there was a bit of maybe of an issue, but was that something that you could have seen in a pre-flight?
No, I don't think so. It was only in that phase of flight where I was climbing out that I would actually even notice something that was off. Pre-flights were all normal. I mean, there was nothing indicative during the pre-flight to say, this is not responding well. Is my mixture valve sticking? Even discrepancies in fuel flow, right? I mean, there was nothing that was telling me that there was a lack of or a limited amount of fuel going into the engine. It was just that it was an odd thing to be enriching the engine as I was climbing up in altitude. And I'm pretty cautious. I mean, I flew my kiddos in this plane quite a few times. We went to the World Series games. We'd visit family. My mechanic gave me even a hard time sometimes because he's like, I mean, yes, I can fix that or look at this, but you don't have to. And I'm like, just do it. I was about 20 to 24 miles out of Prescott. It was pretty uneventful to that point, but when I realized that my EGTs were slowly creeping up, I didn't feel comfortable anymore proceeding with that flight. So I kind of told myself, let's head back home, put it on the ground, and get the mechanic to look at this. As I was coming in to about the 10 to 12 miles, I noticed that by then I had actually increased the mixture almost to full to keep those EGTs relatively within normal operating ranges. I remember it dawned on me that from that 15 mile to the 10 mile, I wanted to start mentally preparing myself for what could happen if things got really bad. So as I was reaching that 10 nautical mile mark, I was at full rich. Typically on full rich on a Cherokee 6, I can be putting in about 20 to 23 gallons an hour into the engine, and my fuel flow is reading 12. I knew I was in some serious trouble. And I remember telling myself that if I was truly planning for a worst case scenario, that altitude was gonna be my friend. I'm gonna keep altitude, I'm gonna stop at descent. I think I had descended like 500 feet at that point. So I was 7,000 to 7,500 feet, and I had just stopped that descent. From the 10 nautical mile to the 5 nautical mile is where things got really bad, really quick.
You mentioned that little click of maintaining your altitude. Where do you think these little hints, intuitions came from? Is that from training? Is that from just flying the airplane so much? Where do you think?
I think it's taking ownership as a pilot for yourself. It was all encompassing. Little bits and nuggets that you pick up from other pilots, right? You just pay attention. They'll give you a lot of wisdom in having pilots that have flown for 20 plus years, right? So I watch safety videos on YouTube, right, from many different places, right, where you're just trying to learn from what's happening in emergencies or incidents. I just remember that being a very crystal clear thought in my mind is I've reached the point of this event where I'm thinking of the worst case scenario. Altitude is my friend, right? They ask you what you're doing or why you're not descending at the normal rate that's common to descent to. You just tell them and say, I'm just keeping some altitude because I'm being cautious. I start feeling very, very subtle vibrations, probably for about 10 seconds. Quickly, those subtle vibrations turned into probably about 4 to 6 seconds of very violent vibrations. It almost felt like to me something had gone wrong in the airframe because it was so violent. And so at that point, I just heard these super loud bangs that came from the front of the aircraft. Boom, boom.
What was your first thought when you heard those bangs and the changes in the engine? Because we've all been there where there's a tiny little noise. Oh, that doesn't sound right. What happens there in your head?
I think it's almost like I had prepared for it for the last 10 miles or so, right? I had already mentally started making that switch. 2 loud bangs, and then my body getting jolted forward of just the total loss of power. And the Cherokee 6s aren't light. They're pretty heavy, so it was a little dramatic. So I just remember thinking, yeah, it's happening. I had complete engine loss at that time. As I lost that power, I remember clicking into the tower and calling a mayday and letting them know that I had full engine loss and that I was going down.
Cherokee 154 Delta Charlie, copy, mayday, 4 miles east of the airport, 6,800, smoke in the cockpit. Are you able to come into the airport and land on runway 30?
I realized at that moment as I was listening to him that I had this just immense amount of thick, dark smoke filling the cabin. And I remember how shocked I was even in the moment that as I was speaking the words about the smoke and the fact that I thought I was going to just go down in a field and that I couldn't see anything, it was so hard to even get those words out because that smoke was just going right into my throat, right into my lungs, and I just felt this almost like heat and burn. I can do with an engine loss, failure, or emergency. I mean, we trained for those. The fact that I had smoke coming into the cabin at such a remarkable rate and I couldn't see anything was what really set in the terror in my heart, in my mind. And I just remember trying to wave in front of my face as rapid and as hard as I could to try to see any instruments whatsoever, and I just couldn't see anything. I remember slamming my face against the side of the windshield there and trying to just see outside and have any reference. I remember my left hand was just grab that yoke and never let go of that yoke. And I just remember thinking to myself that I have to go off of my feelings. Even though I'm not instrument rated, I've always been told that if there's spatial disorientation or anything like that, you always have to trust your instruments. I had a couple seconds before that smoke started coming and I was making the call. So I grabbed that yoke I kind of tried to pitch and look at airspeed as close as I could. I was trying to shoot for about 78 to 80 for best glide. And I just remember telling myself that that's where I had to hold it and try to feel that aircraft out. And what seemed to be like an eternity for me, I'm sure was like a minute. I think once the smoke was coming in there, I was fighting that and visibility issues and everything for about 20 to 30 seconds. And that's when I start feeling heat, like on my toes, like down at my feet. So I look down, and on the co-pilot side, I start seeing flames coming through the floorboard and that firewall from the engine. I felt like this was a snowball effect of just terrifying proportions. Oh my gosh, I'm in a box up in the air where I can't see anything, where I'm choking on smoke, and now I have fire that I have to deal with.
Were you trying to troubleshoot in your head and thinking what could have happened at this stage? Did you know you lost the engine, that you weren't going to restart the engine? Or was in your head, maybe I can try to restart this?
My first initial thought was, for sure, it's something with the engine, right? 2 loud bangs, loss of power. While I was in my head trying to run through troubleshooting what could have caused this and to regain power, I didn't even get that far in that thought process, because by then I start seeing smoke come in. And so I ditched that plan. Now my biggest challenge in front of me was visibility. So I see this fire coming through, and it's amazing how the human brain can do this. But I remember thinking, maybe this is my defeat, the destiny that I have. This is where I am going to lose my life. You're getting the flashback of my kids and my family and my wife and the things that mean the most to me in my life. Flip the switch and realize that if I wanted any chance to see my family again, to be with my wife again, that I had to survive this. With my left hand on the yoke, on my right hand, I just remember digging through the seat pouch in the back, and I grabbed my fire extinguisher and I ripped out the plastic tab and I ripped out the metal tab, and I just shot at my feet, at the panel a little bit. And I just remember holding it for about 2 seconds or so just to see if there would be any reignition. And when I didn't see it, I threw the can to the side. And I remember at that point, I brought all the mixture to idle cutoff, hit all the switches, including my master switch on the left-hand side here on the Piper Cherokee, all electronics off, all the fuel off to the engine at that point.
Is that something that you've ever practiced in the airplane? You said you have a background in firefighting, so that probably helps quite a bit, right?
There was some comfort, I guess, a very small amount of comfort in knowing like, okay, flames are coming. I've done this before, right? Like I know fire suppression. One thing that I give a lot of credit to is that when I would be buying certain things for the airplane, I would always run through the scenario of why I wanted them in there or why they would be in a certain place. That fire extinguisher, I got the bracket and I thought to myself, well, let's just keep it simple, right? I trained with most of them on the floorboard. That was on the laundry list of things that the mechanic was going to mount. But in the meantime, I just remember putting it back here. And I remember when I put it in there and I even reached back, which is crazy to think about, but I reached back and just said, yeah, I can get it. And then sure enough, I didn't think I would use that, but I did. When that fire was put out, I opened the scoop window just to get some ventilation and try to get that smoke out quick as I can. Because the fire had burned a hole in the floorboard of the co-pilot side, that was enough to literally suck the smoke out of that airplane in 5 to 6 seconds or so. And I still feel that feeling even today of the relief of having my eyes back, right? So when that smoke cleared and I look out for the first time in a minute and a half or whatever that time was, I was in control again, and that I had a fighting chance to get this plane down on the ground.
As I listen to you talk about this, things go from bad to worse to even worse. You lost your engine, you got smoke coming in, now you have a fire coming in.
Yeah.
It must have been like, what is going on? And then all of a sudden, you get rid of the fire, there's a hole, the smoke is gone. Is that invigorating at this stage where you're like, okay, now I can make this happen?
The one component of the incident that I hated the most was the smoke, because I physically couldn't see, but also because it robbed me of my piloting, right? So the moment that was gone, it was this immense relief, right? Of just being like, yes, like I recognize this. Like I'm back in the driver's seat, if you will, right? In a very deep way, right? It's when things now started to reconcile.
Just an engine
Sure.
failure all of a sudden becomes such an easier task.
That's right.
Because you can make it happen.
Absolutely.
You had declared an emergency with ATC, and then I guess they went radio silent after that because you were off, right?
They were just trying to comfort me, saying, "Hey, we're sending people your way and do your thing," you know? So I'm assessing the situation and where I'm at, right? Because I've been in a smoke box for about a minute and a half. So I see that I'm banked to the left. My airspeed's okay, but I want to maybe pick that up a little bit. When I look at my altimeter and I look down visually as well, I was probably at about 500 feet above the ground. Because of this being local and me living in the area, I knew exactly where I was immediately. And so I knew that I was in over this subdivision called Granville. And up in front of me is Highway 89A, power lines. And then beyond that, I see just this immense field. And I had this flashback of thinking there was a video I had just watched that was talking about the importance of avoiding the power lines. And, you know, so often as pilots, I remember them saying that there's comfort in going towards roads, right? There's people there. They might see what's happening. It's closer to, so if you're injured, you're closer to civilization. But in the same sense, you get to highways, you get to power lines, and power lines are deadly. So I remember at that point, even thinking in a split second or two that I wanted to avoid them. I didn't care if I had to go out in the middle of nowhere. I just didn't want to hit any power lines. Because that would truly be probably one of the worst things I could do at that moment. I remember coming in and having my face on the glass and looking at my descent rate and judging it from the power line. The moment I passed over those power lines and I looked down must have been no more than 50 feet or so, that difference between the power lines and my gear. All my focus, all my energy now transferred from here to straight out. I remember hearing my flight instructor's voice, "Can you survive this?" So as I was coming in on short approach, I treated it as close to a soft field landing as possible. I remember thinking on short approach that there was no way that I wanted to flip this plane in some random field out here and potentially die from that. I just remember telling myself, I have a field for days, and I will try to keep that nose wheel off the ground as long as possible. So as I came in, I just remember thinking, you know, soft field landing, touch it. It was quite honestly probably one of my best landings that I've ever had. And I do tell folks that it's not surprising because it's like my life depended on it. And so I remember touching very softly down on the field or on the ground and keeping that nose wheel up as I was just kind of rumbling and rumbling. Again, these are feelings and sensations that I've never felt before. It's like all the things that we talk about in books and in training, now we're actually being felt physically by my body and, you know, being actually tangible things that I'm dealing with in life. So I remember thinking, okay, so wherever my backside goes, right? So if it dips to the right, I would just hit that right rudder. And if I would feel it dip to the left, I'd hit the left rudder. And again, I'm kind of making this stuff up just based on life experience. After what felt like a 10-second to 15-second rollout, the plane comes to a stop. I just remember thinking that I was so happy to be on the ground. Everything was shut off at that point. I had no fuel. I just made sure everything was out, undid my buckle, literally just got out of that plane as fast as possible. But I was very, very happy to be on the ground.
You get out, how does it feel?
It was just such a surreal moment. So much of that event was packed in emotionally and physically that being on the ground was just gratitude. I didn't know the extent of the damage. Mm-hmm. And the plane was pretty much untouched on the airframe other than, you know, these giant holes, the severity of like the engine damage, mm-hmm. co-pilot side of the engine compartment. It's surreal too to think that just moments before you're on the ground, you're literally in what felt like a flying box of smoke mm-hmm. and fire. So it just seems like trying to process that. Did that really just happen?
Yeah.
This is not a dream, right? Mm-hmm. I'm going to go see my wife tonight mm-hmm. and I'm going to go see my kids and I'm going to go tell them what a ridiculously crazy thing happened to me.
Because they have no idea at this stage.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. How does your wife feel about you flying again?
she was pushing me to do it sooner than I wanted it. Yeah, maybe a month after, she's like, so you gonna go fly, or are you scared? You know, because you wonder too, right? I mean, my poor wife that day was a wreck.
Oh, I bet.
I mean, she would get alerted on an app when our plane would take off or land, right? So that day, she looked me up on the app and saw that I had stopped in the field. Of course, in her mind, she's thinking the worst, right? It was very intense for her, right? She's out of control. I had control of that situation. She didn't. I was, very glad to be encouraged by her and say, yeah, it was terrifying, but your piloting paid off, right? It's like I would make fun of you watching safety pilot videos in the middle of the night. She would always joke, right? She's like, why? Why would you put all this stuff in your head about how bad things can get? And I just tell her, I was like, because I'm wired to want to overcome those things, right? Like if it happens, then I'll have something to pull from the bank or the memory bank to refine myself as a pilot. And so now she's like, I'm so glad you nerded out on wanting to watch the videos and better yourself as a pilot.
People don't understand the dark side of pilots watching accidents and learning from it, but that's the only way that we move forward.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it is difficult sometimes to do, but we have to learn from that.
What I walked away with is that I'm so glad that I took the training and the knowledge of aviation and how to be a good pilot very seriously. So training, without a shadow of a doubt, played a huge part in the outcome of this day. Coupled with that was also instinct and being fully committed to the decisions that you're making in such a horrific time. I guess my advice to anybody that would be in any similar situation would be that you have to make an intentional decision to put the emotions aside, the unfairness of the event aside, and make it a moment where you choose to put yourself to the test and challenge yourself with being the best pilot that you could ever imagine that you could be in that moment. That was probably one of the biggest lessons and something that I'll walk away with and take with me for the rest of my life. So for student pilots, take your training seriously, take ownership of your pilot career, of your own safety, of the safety of the folks that are on board with you. Because in a moment like this, and what I had to live out on this day, is that no one's there to bail you out or help you or guide you through these, but only your training and only your intuition and only you taking charge of that moment, believing in yourself and taking the confidence of who you are as a pilot in that moment. That's what's going to be more important for you.